Okay. Well, we are nearing the end of this study.
Of this study, yeah.
Yes.
Getting closer.
We are, probably a week or two within, by our estimation, should pretty well be wrapping up the text tonight and do a final wrap up next week.
And hopefully, here was my plan. I don't know if I ran this by you, but my thought
okay.
was,
I have run some stuff by you.
Okay, well, my thought was for next week, we'll do a lot of the things that I would want to do then is have a recap of a lot of the highlights of John. But I was going to try to have a handout prepared that is small enough to fit in your Bible, hopefully something that will fit, right in the book of John, so that anytime you turn there, hopefully it will be very simple, but just an overview of here's the highlights in the book of John. Here, if you hear a sermon or a lesson or a Bible class reference to a text in John, at least for me, going back and thinking about, well, here's the text of John in, a sentence or two, and here's the main events. And if you're in chapter 8 and you're like, oh, I know that in chapter 9, that's going to be when he heals the blind man. I know that in chapter 7, there are, other great things that are happening there as well. And so as you're putting the puzzle pieces together and studying, and come back to this in the future, because that's what I'm thinking of. I mean, it's wonderful, it's great to be in the text, but being able to come back and reference all the things that we've learned at a brief glance, I think is what is a lasting impression on me for when I'm studying something in the future. And so I'm hoping that I can create something that's small enough and, I don't know what you want to call that, concise enough, because I sometimes ramble on.
That's the challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, concise enough that will be helpful for us in future studies and in future things that go on. Something to keep with you from the study. It's not just another Bible class, but it's something that we have something tangible to look back on in the future.
What a great idea! I hope you succeed. That would be good. We could even we've got a laminator. We could laminate those things.
John
they
the
would last
Laminator.
forever. John the Laminator. Okay, so here we go then.
Well, but before we
And
get
it
too far
starts.
into this, I did have I wanted
Oh,
to
boy.
shameless plug my own stuff here, which is great here. Anyways, shameless plug. The great thing I was waiting for you to say, "Hey, Justin," so I could jump in with this, but I don't want to take too much class time away from this. But yesterday they came and dug a big hole at our property, so
Yes.
we're going to be having a basement sometime soon. So we're excited for that. That's great and wonderful. Also, the reason why I actually brought that up was because I would like to invite some of the, men and women of all, we would accept help from anyone, but here in the future, we're probably going to be planning, hopefully, again, with permission of everyone involved, and hopefully planning some kind of a work day kind of a thing, maybe on a Saturday, and we'll feed you, and coming out and maybe helping us put some things up. And if you are interested in that, let me know. We'd like to know if people would want to do that and how willing they would be. And I'd also love to hear any advice you may have. It might be like I hear it and I think, I might do something different. But I would appreciate any help with the project, even if it's just, hey, don't fall down the stairs. I don't know. I'm open to whatever. Anyways, long story short, I wanted to get that out there now that it's officially starting. So,
I sense your excitement. That's good.
yeah, it's going to be great.
I'm happy for you guys that you got started on that work, and I'm busy that day. So, no, I'd be glad to volunteer Tracy to come out and help you sometime. So, no, that's a good idea, man.
We also need supervisors. So if that day you want to come out and eat food and supervise, we do that too. Tell me how to do stuff. I mean, I know I'll be there, but anyways.
All right. So we can. That's a good idea. Well, I totally forgot what I was going to say now. That was serious as a lead into what we're doing today. But that's good. I'm glad for you guys. We are ready to wrap up. So we're in John 21, last chapter of the book of John. We have begun that chapter. So in chapter 19, Jesus is crucified. In chapter 20, Jesus is. We discover that Jesus has been raised. and there's some interactions amongst the disciples. There's some interactions with Jesus and Mary Magdalene. There's some interaction with Jesus and some of the disciples or the apostles in the upper room, and they're still kind of surprised at all the happenings that are going on. And then we got to the end of the chapter, verses 30 and 31 give us sort of our thesis statement from the book of John. Many other signs, therefore, Jesus also performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these have been written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. And so that led us into chapter 21, which you it was an interesting thought that seems to be a proper end to the gospel, but it's not an end to the story. There's more that takes place after that, and so it's the sort of the end of the story of the crucifixion and those kind of things. But there's unfinished business, if you will. There's things that need to happen after that, and so we have more appearances of Jesus, or a final appearance of Jesus rather, in Galilee, and this would be a week later in John 21. So we looked at the first 14 verses last week, and we saw the catching of the fish. They'd fished all night, but they didn't catch any fish, and this is kind of a replay of something that happens earlier in Jesus' ministry, and it's a sort of a calling once again of his disciples to be fishers as they have struggled all night under their own power and own wisdom and own idea of going fishing. But then Jesus shows up and he tells them to throw your net out one more time, and then they catch that huge catch of fish. So sort of makes a nice symmetry with the beginning and the end of the calling of the disciples, and bringing us back around to that idea that Jesus is the source of their power, of their message. So that gets us, as I recall, I think we're ready for verse 15. And as I recall now, I didn't reset the slides. I just have John 21. I know we've made some changes to the slides, but let's, there we go. Okay, John 21:15 through 17. And this is, this part. I don't think we'll rush through this part. I think we'll have some discussion here. So beginning in verse 15, it says, "So when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?' He said to him, 'Yes, Lord, you know that I love you.' He said to him, 'Tend my lambs.' He said to him again a second time, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me?' He said to him, 'Yes, Lord, you know that I love you.' He said to him, 'Shepherd my sheep.' He said to him the third time, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me?' Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, 'Do you love me?' And he said to him, 'Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you.' Jesus said to him, 'Tend my sheep.'"
So, the first time, so after they had finished breakfast, now jumping back in from where we came from last week, there are a couple things that will re-come up as a theme from the first half of the chapter to the second half. But when they had finished breakfast, they were cooking this breakfast on the charcoal fire, and this was, again, a specific reference back to, the last time, the only time that word is used in the New Testament, to John chapter 19, or 18. It's John 19, when Peter... Well, no, it's John 18, rather. Yes, I see here now. So John chapter 18, it talks about when Simon Peter is denying Jesus. He goes into the place of the high priest, and they are standing around a charcoal fire. John 18, verse 15, all the way to verse 25. Peter will deny Jesus 3 times. And coming off of that, denial. Again, Jesus has said to his disciples, "If you deny me before men, I will deny you before my Father." This is a big deal. This is a big thing. And obviously, as we've talked about in the past, that Jesus has appeared to Peter. Jesus has shown up to and has had some sort of interaction with Peter privately. But here's a public demonstration, a public reinstatement, if you will, of Peter. But here's what I wanted to hone in on here. So Jesus is specifically creating this atmosphere They have just had this great night of fishing. They caught about a goose egg. In the water, they pulled it up, and it was actually a goose egg. No, they caught 0 fish. They didn't catch anything, and Jesus says, cast your net over there. They catch a whole bunch of fish. Peter says, oh man, it's the Lord. And so he is still Peter. Now, he didn't make some great personality change. He's not an entirely different person. He still jumps in the water. He swims to the shore. Jesus, again, Jesus is making breakfast. They eat breakfast. After they have finished breakfast, Jesus asks Peter this question. He's created this atmosphere. There's this charcoal fire here. There's the other disciples are sitting around him. Or at least 7 of the other disciples are around him, or 6 rather, without Peter. But the other disciples are there, and Jesus says to Peter, he says, Simon, son of John. He doesn't call him Peter. He starts off with saying, Simon, son of John. This is your identity before you met me. Simon, son of John. Now some have, again, we talked about last week how Jesus is rebuking him kind of for going back to fishing because Peter was disobeying the Lord. Jesus said to wait for him by going to this mountain and he will meet them there. And there will some that will heavily emphasize the fact that Peter should have been going to the mountain and waiting for God there and not going off and doing his own old style of living, going back there. And this is a proof that, well, when Jesus says, Simon, you've gone back to your old ways and I don't approve of this, I don't necessarily know if that's what he's saying here, but what he does say is, he said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John. He doesn't reference him as Peter. And again, he'll do that again the second time he asks. He will say, Simon. I think that's important. I think that's, in saying Simon, son of John, or son of Jonas, depending on how you translate that into English, it's basically what Jesus is doing is he is like your mother using your full name. He's saying, listen up, okay? I am rebuking you right now. Pay attention. You have denied that you have a relationship with me. You have denied the name of Peter. You have denied the relationship that we had as Jesus and Peter, as Jesus and disciple, as Lord and Master, because you have claimed 3 times not to be connected to me in any way. And so I think it's intentional, him saying, this is where you're at. This is where you're standing. This is where you've put yourself as someone outside of the fold, as someone outside of a relationship with me, and this is the name that you have when you're outside of me. And he says, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Now, this is there's, again, debate on what the these here is meaning. One example that people will say is, and I think it's a good way of thinking, well, do you love me more than these? And he's pointing at the fish. He's pointing at the boat he just got out of. He's pointing at the net that they don't have to mend because it didn't break. He's pointing at the tools of the trade that Peter has. He says, Simon Peter, do you love me? Is there something in your life that you love more than me is the question that he's asking. Do you love something in your life more than Jesus? And on one hand, that could be these nets. That could be the fish. That could be his lifestyle as a fisherman. Do you love me more than these things of your lifestyle? And Jesus will say, do you love me more than your old life? And I think, again, because I believe the actual question he's asking is there anything in your life that you love more than me? I think that's a good comparison of it's a do you love me more than these things? It's a comparison between do you love me or do you love your work? Do you love me or do you love the thing you used to do? Do you love me or do you love being outside apart from me, your life apart from me? Another potential thing that could be the antecedent, I think is the right word in English, of the these there, that it's pointing to is the other disciples. Because according to Peter's own words, back before Jesus is crucified, he will say, even if all these other people, they don't love you like I do, I love you more. I love you so much more than all these other disciples. By Peter's own mouth, he said, if they forsake you, my love is greater. My love is better. I love you more than the other disciples. And so Jesus is saying, do you really, he's confronting Peter for his failure, do you really, when it really mattered, was your behavior any different than anyone else? Did you really show and prove the love that you claim to have? Because Peter has fallen to the trap, the failure, the sin, I think that we all find ourselves in at times. He overestimated his commitment to God. He overestimated his love. He underestimated his ability and his vulnerability to sin. Because in our lives, sometimes, and again, this is more bringing it home to us, when we think, oh, I would never commit such a sin, I think that we're in the mindset of Peter of being so prideful. I'm so filled with pride, I don't have a weakness. I'm not vulnerable to sin. Now, again, I mean, in extreme cases, I think that that there is some negative truth to the idea of, well, when you see someone that has murdered many people and have had people for lunch, I mean, I would never do that. But when you start thinking about, well, I would never fall in such a way, when you hear about other people's failures, well, I would never fall in such a way, I think he's confronting a little bit of the pride that we all feel when we say, you know what, I don't think I would fall to that sin. I am better than other people. I am more devoted to God than other people, and so I wouldn't fall to these sins. Because I think one of the lessons that we can learn is that our weakness is something that is very pervasive. It is something that we shouldn't underestimate, how much sin can creep into our lives. We are not invulnerable to Satan's crafty tricks, his darts. I mean, I don't care who you are. Again, I'm not saying that preachers have anything above anyone else, but there are many preachers that fall to sexual sin. There are many preachers that fall to whatever sin you want. There are elders that fall to those kind of things. If we start to think that, oh, sin is just going to pass me by, I can follow God and I can handle whatever temptation comes, I think we've fallen into a prideful approach to who God is and who we are. There are people out there that will say, well, we have a sin nature, that we are designed for sin, that we cannot get away from sinning. And while I do not believe that it is something that our nature automatically includes, because God made us and He made us perfect, and we screwed it up, I do think that we all have the vulnerability, the weaknesses to sin. And when we start to put ourselves above other people and say, well, I would never fall into that trap, or I would never fall into that sin, we've overestimated our own power to avoid temptation without God, without Jesus, without leaning on Him. Now, again, I think that there's a difference, a little bit, of saying, you know what, because I am living in the Spirit, because I am being guided by the Spirit, because I have the Word of God, because I am devoting myself daily to Scripture, that there is a little bit of confidence that can be gained because we are walking with Christ. But it's not our walking. It's not our walk. It's not our ability that we have, that we would avoid or we would come through temptation. But it is us leaning and relying on Jesus to make it through that. So I think that is one of the things that I wanted to bring up there, is that we shouldn't overestimate our own abilities to avoid temptation or underestimate our vulnerabilities to Satan's darts, because they can get us at any time. And if we slowly become lax in our vigilance in staying unstained from sin, as James would say, and 1 John has many different times, walking in the light. If we start withholding ourselves from the Spirit, from the Scriptures, from God, we'll slowly fall into this trap as well.
I think you made a couple of good points. And the passage that comes to mind, and I thought I knew where it was, but I've turned to the wrong place, and I can't think of where it is. But let him that thinketh he stand take heed lest he fall. And I think Peter learned that lesson in a very real and hard way there. That pre-denial Peter was as sure that he wouldn't deny Christ as he could be sure of anything. I mean, he would have bet his life on it. I mean, he was willing to bet his life on it in the garden because he was willing to go to battle. He was willing to take on the Roman. Well, he lopped off one of the Jewish priest's ears, but that could have brought a Roman response. I mean, he was willing to go to battle. But then when the tables were turned and things went differently than he thought they were going to go, then he faltered and he failed. So he was sure of his ability to not deny Jesus, and he thought he could stand, and he couldn't. And I think that's a tremendous and valuable lesson for us to learn, and most of us probably have to learn that the hard way at some point along the way. And then the other thing, the idea of that you brought out about pointing at the fish or the material things, brought to mind the rich young ruler that came to see Jesus, and Jesus listed all those things. Don't commit adultery, don't murder, don't don't do these things. And he's like, oh, I've nailed it. I've got all those things. I've done all of them. And then Jesus said, well, there's one more thing. Sell all that you have and give to the poor and come and follow me. And then that was the one thing that he loved more than Jesus. And he went away sorrowful because of that. And so, I think that's an interesting perspective. I don't think I'd ever considered that before, and is an interesting way to think of it. I think the later example is more the way I've always leaned, and probably the one I still prefer of interpretation of that passage. But it still does bring to mind an interesting thing to think about, and I think is a good reflection for us as we consider what to learn from this passage. Johnny?
Peter thinks that he can love Jesus better than anybody else is one of those traps that Justin's talking about.
It is a pride. Yeah, sure. And I think that's where that whole idea of that passage, I can't remember where it's at. 1 Corinthians 10. Thank you. I was in Romans and it wasn't there. I could have looked in Romans all day and wouldn't have found it if it's in 1 Corinthians 10. So, but they, that attitude itself is born of pride. And so Peter's, and you think about some of the episodes the disciples had when they're arguing over who is the greatest in the kingdom or who can sit on Jesus' right hand or his left hand, and the other disciples are indignant, not because they're mad that they just asked before I did. I wanted to sit there, is what they're thinking, and that's not fair. They asked before I got around to it. And so, so we see kind of some of this prideful stuff come out in the disciples here and there, and this episode with Peter is, boy, it's a humbling episode for Peter, and we see that humility. We see that humility come out here, I think, in the way that Peter responds to Jesus. We'll talk about in a minute. Tim.
Consider it because
Yes.
Peter, Christ had already declared, I'm going to build my church on this rock, Cephas. He'd already sealed it. In other words, it's just like when we accept Christ and he's,
Yeah.
we're one of his own,
Yeah.
but it doesn't mean we're not going to stumble. It doesn't mean we're not going to fall.
Yeah.
But he is willing to forgive and draw you back in.
Yeah.
If you'll just do what he says.
Yeah. And I think you make a good point. He has, I think, referring back to that Matthew 16 passage, not to take issue too much with you, but the way I read that is he says, I'll build. He builds it upon the confession that Peter makes, I think, not upon Peter himself. I don't think Peter is the foundation of the church. I think the truth that Jesus is the Son of God is the foundation of the church, as it is in John. I mean, these things have been written so that you might believe, and in believing you would have life in his name. And so, yeah, okay. I appreciate that distinction, because there is.
We don't go down Roman Catholic field.
Yeah, okay. Well, I appreciate that distinction, because it kind of was like, that made me think there for a minute. And so I appreciate that. And Peter does make that, there are so many good things that Peter does along the way, when his boldness and his willingness to be the first to take that step is exactly what Jesus wanted to see in him. It's exactly why Jesus called him. And now, in this, I think in this episode, we see Peter pulling back, and Peter thinking, I went way past where I should have been, and I ran out so far ahead of where I should have been, and I got humbled so badly, and I got hurt so badly by what happened, that I'm going to back off, and I'm not going to be the person Jesus needs me to be, because I'm scared of going too far again, and I don't want to get too far ahead of Justin here and the things he's going to talk about, but this idea that Peter has learned a valuable lesson, but if he stops where he's at right now, if Jesus doesn't go through these next few verses with him and lead him through this process, then I think Peter learns the wrong thing from the lesson, and that is back off and don't be the person I need to be for Jesus. It's become the opposite of what Jesus called me to be. So So I want you to get through your stuff,
Okay.
and so I don't want to go too much further there, but because I want to hear the agape phileo stuff.
Okay, well, so backing up all that to, I mean, this is just the first like 4 words on the page. Anyways, so the second part of the first bullet point that I've alluded to quite a bit, but I wanted to make sure I hit it before I move on, was that Jesus, I think, taking a step back from that, sometimes when people make mistakes, because people do, and maybe this is just me, maybe this is just, again, a lot of my development of attitudes about different things in society and culture come a lot from when I was at college. But sometimes when people make mistakes and people mess up and people make a mess of their life, make a mess of the situation, make a mess of things, there are, at least in my mind, there are 2 different responses. Sometimes it's, double down on, well, that was your fault and you're the worst and you should have done better, which I don't know if really is something that happens all that much in my life, but on the other hand, I think sometimes, and again, maybe this isn't specifically for McPherson, this was just more the atmosphere that I had at Freed was, the idea that, if you make a mistake, well, that's okay. You were under a lot of pressure. There was a lot going on, and there was just, it wasn't a very good day for you, and there was just so much, you're just in a really tough situation. And that's sometimes the way that we approach, and that I guess I have kind of seeped in and learned to approach failure with this idea of, well, we need to, and that's, I think, our society at large, is we need to cushion the impact of, well, failure, it's okay to fail. And again, I want to say, we'll get to that later, but I think on one hand, Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus sets up a fire saying, I know what was going on in your world at that time when you were denying me. I know that there was a lot of pressure. I know that there was a lot on your mind. I know that you have denied me and done something terrible. But Jesus confronts him and says, do you love me? Do you love me? Are you still on my team? Are you still in my camp? Because I know what you've done, and I know that you have claimed not to be in my camp, not to be my disciple, not to love me at all, to have no relationship with me. And Jesus, confronting Peter's failure, says, do you love me more than these? And again, Jesus being as compassionate and as humble, I mean, again, I sometimes think about Moses, right, in Numbers. I think it's Numbers 12, verse 3 or 4. He says, he's the humblest man, the most humble man to walk the days of the earth was Moses. It's like, well, that's wonderful. But Jesus being humble, being compassionate, God incarnate, doesn't necessarily sugarcoat the truth. He doesn't come out and start beating up Peter and saying, well, you denied me so bad, and look at all these people around you. He doesn't publicly embarrass Peter. But he does point out the fact that you have failed me. He says, Simon, do you love me more than these? And again, I think most of that is from the atmosphere that Jesus is creating and from the direct way that Jesus will say 3 times. He does it intentionally 3 times. Now, again, we'll get into that. We'll get into point 2 here right now. We'll do that. So, Jesus says, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Now, what I'm going to get into this next, and there's agape and phileo on the board, and I bolded them and underlined them because I kind of did that as we were reading it. Obviously, we can't go back and reread that, but...
Sure we can.
Well, anyway, so... I did it backwards. So anyways...
Never mind.
The bolding and the underlining is backwards. But so this is the way that it goes. So Jesus will say to Simon, do you agape me? Now there are some in the Greek scholar circles. I'm going to throw this out there at the beginning that don't put nearly as much emphasis on this as other people. That these words mean love. That trying to say that agape is this divine love may be a step too far because it's another word. But sometimes we can build mountains out of molehills and get into, well, agape just means the greatest divine love ever. It's self-sacrificing. It's the only one true love that we should have, and it's the godly kind of love. And I mean, there are some that will say, well, I mean, it's another word for love, and there is lots of connotation behind that. And we'll say, but I mean, phileo is just another word for love. The meaning is somewhat similar. There are some that will say that, but there is a vast majority, and I mean, I don't know, I'm a little bit on the fence of putting a lot of emphasis on the word agape and saying, you know what, we don't want to be we don't want to take this language that we have very little actual experience with on a daily basis and run with whatever we want to run with. But agape is known a little bit as the love of God. When God loves something, it's most always, I believe, always use the term agape. Because when he loves something, he loves it unconditionally. He loves it fully. And so, on one hand, it is, I believe, the only word that is used to describe the love that God feels for people. There might be some specific instances where they use a different kind, but most of the time, it is God's divine love used in the word agape. And so, without placing too much emphasis here, I do want to say that there is emphasis in Scripture on these words. Do you agape me? Do you love me unconditionally? Do you love me to the max with divine love? And Peter will say, of course, Lord, you know that I love you like a brother. Of course, Lord, you know that I love you like one of my best friends. And that's kind of the connotation to the word phileo. You know, Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, which I don't know, I've never been there. I've heard that maybe it's not so loving, but agape is most often referred to as a God-type love, and phileo is a brotherly type love. And so Jesus will say, do you love me more than anything else, unconditionally, to the max, fully? And Peter will respond, Lord, you know that I love you like a brother. Which again, going back to the first bullet point, instead of Peter jumping out there and saying, you know what, Jesus, I divinely love you, and I divinely love you more than anybody else, like he would have, I believe, before the denial. He says, I am questioning my own commitment to that kind of love. That kind of love is just, it is, I feel like it is unattainable for me right now. I cannot say that I truly, unconditionally, divinely love you, Jesus, but I can say that, God, I love you like a brother, like my best friend, like I love you with that kind of love, but I don't feel like I can attain to that because I've proven by what I've done that the agape type of love isn't what's living within me. And so, we don't want to put too much emphasis on all of that, but I do think that there is a nugget of truth to this idea that Peter feels like he cannot claim, lay his stake on, yes, Jesus, I agape love you. And so he says, I love you like a brother. Jesus will ask again, Simon, you know that I love you? And he'll say, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he will say a third time, son of John, again, the agape, do you agape me? No, I phileo you. Or you know that I phileo you. And then at the end, Jesus will say, well, Peter, do you, and it's again, this is putting words into the text, but do you really even phileo me? Is that can you even attain to that level of love? Do you even attain to that level of not necessarily trust, but loyalty in this frame of love? And I believe, I think that there is a twofold here when it says that Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time. The third time being, this is 3 times he said this, again, because he has 3 times he has denied Jesus. So the significant number of 3 times he is denied and 3 times Jesus has said, do you love me? I think that there is something to be said there. But I also think that there is, at least to me, a little more emphasis placed on Jesus drops down to his level and says, do you really love me at this level? And Peter will say, Lord, you know everything, and you know that I love you. I phileo you. And I think that there's 2 sides of that. On one hand, it's saying, is this phileo love that you claim, is it something you can stake your claim in? But Peter will come back and say, you know what? I can say that I do love you like a brother. I am committed at this level. This is where I'm at, Jesus, and you have come down to my level, and I will say, you know what? Even if you have to come down to my level, I will still be committed to loving you. And this is the love that I have from you. And this is the love that I will have for you from time to come. And Jesus will say to him, let's see here, the ESV says, the first time feed my lambs the first time. The second time, tend my sheep. And the third time, feed my sheep. And he will say, Peter, I'll use you where you're at. Peter, I still have a use for you. I still have something, I can still use you. You don't have to, you may be looking at where you're at and in your failure saying, you know what, God, I can't attain to that perfect, righteous kind of love as agape is commonly referred to as. But I will say, God, that I love Jesus. I love you as my brother. I love you as my best friend. I love you as one of the closest relationships in my life. And Jesus says, okay, I'll use you. I'll use you where you're at. While we're on this fun subject of Greek, the reply that Jesus says is also heavily influenced in Greek. The first thing that he says is, feed my lambs. Feed my lambs. And again, the reason why it says lambs there, and it'll say sheep the next two times, is because that word is for the weakest and the young in the group of the herd. The lambs, if you will, feed the ones that are weak. Feed the ones that are sick. Feed the ones that are ailing. Take care. Pasture really is another verbiage. Pasture my lambs. Take them to pasture. Take care of them. Be there for them. Feed them. Give them what they need. And take care of the weak. Jesus again will say he loves his sheep. He knows his sheep by name. And one of the things that he's saying here, Peter, is, Peter, I know that you failed, but even the weakest and the young among my people, I am entrusting you with them. That, Peter, you're not going to be perfect. You're not going to. You may need to dial back a little bit of that brash arrogance, but you're still someone that I want to put in charge of not only my sheep but my lambs. The people the young, the people that term again is likely more endearing a little bit than the sheep. Yes, his sheep, he knows his sheep's name, but the lambs, the newborn lambs. Jesus again, as people, we're newborn lambs. I have a need for you to take care of them, even if you're not perfect. Even in your weakness, I will still use you. And then again, he goes in to say, feed my sheep and tend my sheep. So there's a pretty, I guess, again, a heavy relevance on each part of what's going on here in the original language of, you know what, do you agape me? I phileo you. Do you agape me? I phileo you. Do you phileo me? Yes, Lord. You know everything. You know my heart. You know what's going on. I do love you. Okay, then take care of those that are the most precious to me. Take care of the ones that are the most vulnerable. Take care of those that can't take care of themselves, because I know you're going to be a leader, and I know you're going to be someone in my church that can be a shepherd.
It's all. Well, let me stammer for a minute. I think one of the most powerful parts of the whole story of Jesus is this restoration of Peter. I love this part of the story because of the depth of the conversation in so few words, but the depth of the meaning, and I appreciate what you pulled out with the meaning of those two words. And I do think there's a significance there, and a significance to the repetition of the word agape. And when you think about what Jesus has called us, what does Jesus call people to? And what is the greatest commandment? To love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love one another as yourself. And what word is that? It's agapao. That's agape. I mean, it's the same word here. He's asking the verb form instead of the noun form. But that's what God calls us to. God calls us to agape. Are we going to achieve that ever fully in any form of the word? I mean, but do we ever fully achieve anything God calls us to by our own power, by our own strength? No. And so when Peter here, I think, is acknowledging the fact that I can't claim to have agape love for you, Christ, because I denied you. It would be insult to injury. Now, if you asked me, do you agape me, and I said yes, no, you can't say yes. It's obvious you don't, because you denied me. You denied me 3 times. You denied me with an oath. You denied me with vulgarity. And so for Peter to lay claim to agape is beyond him at that moment. And so but imagine the humiliation of being reminded of that, and then for Jesus to say, well, do you phileo me? I'm changing my expectations for you, Peter, because I have expected agape. That's what I've called everybody to. That's what my message has been from the beginning. You claim you can't give that, so do you phileo me? And Peter is grieved at that. I would be heartbroken if my Lord thought that I was not capable of any better than I have demonstrated. But Jesus calls him to the same thing, regardless of, he said, agape, do you agape me? No, I phileo you. Well, feed my sheep, tend my lambs, feed my sheep. His expectations of Peter don't change based on what Peter feels like he's able to give. And so God calls us to a standard. He calls us to his perfect standard every time, and we fall short. He never stops calling us to that standard, and he never lessens his expectations of what he wants from us. Give me the best that you have. Give me all that you can give me. I have work for you to do. And on the one hand, the heartbreak that Peter feels at being reminded of his failure and being, almost in a public way called out because he's there in front of the other disciples who know what he's done. They witnessed it or they've heard of it. And to be reminded of it publicly in that way, but then to also be restored because, Peter, I still have work for you to do. I'm not changing my expectations for you. I'm not changing who I want you to be. I want you to be the shepherd of this flock. And then think of what Jesus said back in John 10. Who is the true shepherd? True shepherd is Christ. He is the good shepherd. And he was given that role as the good shepherd because he was willing to lay down his life for the sheep. And verse 12, John 10, verse 12, he who is a hireling and not a shepherd, who is not the owner of the sheep, beholds the wolf coming and does what? He leaves. He runs away. And he flees. And the wolf snatches them and scatters them. And he flees because he is a hireling and he is not concerned about the sheep. What is Peter just got done telling Jesus, I can't agape you. I can't. I'm not capable. I can't claim that level of love. And Jesus still tells him to shepherd his sheep. Peter, you're more than a hireling. I'm depending on you to be the shepherd that I know you can be. And so I think the restoration here as it fits into the story of John is just a tremendous thing. Sam?
I definitely read it not just as him charging Peter with it, but responding to what he says.
Yeah.
When he says, yes, I love you, he's saying, okay, then this is how you do it. Jesus said, a new commandment I give you, even as I have loved you, love one another.
Right.
So when he's saying love me, he says, okay, now it's time for you to go love like I did, just
Right.
like I told you was your
Yeah.
new commandment.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And I think Jesus is not content for Peter to hide behind his failure. It is important to Jesus that Peter get past that failure and move on to what Jesus has called him to do, and Jesus knows he's capable of doing. And so this is for Peter's benefit. It's for Peter to understand the expectation that Jesus has had on him. It's for the benefit of the other disciples that are there hearing it, so that they understand that Peter, you guys don't shut Peter out here. You don't get to vote him off the island. You don't get to tell him that because he denied me, he is no longer fit. I'm giving him work to do, and I'm giving him work to do in front of you so that you know that it's his work to do. Not that he's elevating Peter to a higher apostleship status than the others, but that he is saying that Peter is going to be an important part of the work. So it's I just can't. There are so many facets and levels and layers to. It's 3 verses, but there's so many different ways to poke at it, prod at it, and look at it from different perspectives, and as we've done it in several different places in the book, it's like, put yourself there. Put yourself seated to Peter's right in the campfire. Put yourself seated across from him, seeing the expression on his face. Put yourself in Peter's body, hearing Jesus ask you that question. And and think of various times in your life when it would mean one thing versus another, because there are times when we do well and there are times when we fail. And so it's just a tremendous, I don't know, it's one of my favorite stories. And so I like it. Greg.
I think all that's true, and building on what Sam was saying, I think Jesus is not only restoring Peter, but he's telling him what it means to love me. As he told the parable of the Good Samaritan, what does it mean to love your neighbor? And he put some flesh on that concept, and so he's not only restoring Peter and helping him to get past the point where he's been, but he's saying this is what I have in mind for you to do, and this is how you love me.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. Peter had a vision in his mind pre-denial. Peter had a picture in his mind of what true love for Christ meant, and it meant going to battle for Christ and laying down his life and becoming a martyr in that way, in that moment in the garden. And when that didn't happen, that world for Peter was shattered. His view of what it meant in that moment to love Christ was no longer available to him. And so now what am I left with? And he was lost. And so he responded in a way that really an hour earlier would have been out of character for him. But now, because everything has changed, it's the only response that he felt he had in the moment. And so Jesus is helping him define what love is, so that if you want to claim that you love me in the way that I want you to, then here's how you do that. And that's how you can love me. That's a great point.
Don, you have something to say?
See if I can remember. If you look back at Judas, right there at Judas, how he handled everything. And then you have Jesus going, he's going away. Here's Peter trying to hide, and he's, it's all, you can see a crescendo getting ready to happen here. But what happens is, he comes to the godly sorrow that he needs to have at the point when he's with Jesus at that point, and they're talking about love. He's been, he's seen Jesus twice with the apostles, once without Thomas and then with Thomas. And then here they are, they're together at this situation, and you're talking about the charcoal. That had to spark something in his mind about the whole setting of him denying, and just the charcoal itself in the fire. But when he's talking with Jesus, I think that conversation of love is helping him solidify that godly sorrow that he actually has, and he handles it in the right way. And he allows Jesus to work with him and use him in the way that he had planned to use him, as we see later on in Acts.
I think you're right, and it is a great reminder for him, and a great reminder of the calling that Jesus is bringing, the calling that Jesus called him to, for how he is to live and what that means for him. No, that's good.
Well, I think, go ahead, Johnny.
Before we pass over this, I'd like to point out that he continues to try and set these apostles up to feed his sheep. He's just spent the last 3 years telling the Pharisees and the Sadducees that they weren't feeding his sheep. All through the Old Testament, over and over again, the leadership that was supposed to keep his flock in line and keep feeding them, the number of times he said, "Oh, you fed yourselves, but you let my sheep die, starve to death, because you never gave them anything to eat." To me, there's 2 points to this. We're supposed to feed the sheep. Those disciples and apostles were going to start his church. And if they didn't do their job, his church wouldn't have started then. It would have started, he'd have got it there, but a different way. But they were to feed his sheep, and they were to keep feeding the sheep. Not do it once, but to keep feeding them. And on the other side, as you like to say, as sheep, we need to be fed all the time. And that's what we have been trying to get across to so many here. You need to be here to get fed. You need to get fed. And that's what you guys are doing right now. You're feeding us. And if you're not here, you're not getting fed. And we're sheep. Sheep are dumb. You know?
I didn't say
We need fed.
I'm the chief sheep in that case.
If you don't feed the sheep, they eat the church.
Oh, man. That's not a good visual. And if the shepherds aren't feeding the sheep, then the wolves come and eat the sheep too. And so there's lots of aspects of that. By the way, a closing thought maybe, this whole discussion, let's see, we spent all of last year talking about love, and in the elders preachers meeting in probably November of, what year is it, 24? November of 22, when we were talking about what we would talk about in 23, we decided we would study John, and one of the reasons was this passage. We kind of missed it in 23 when we did the study on love. But John as the gospel of love and the one whom Jesus loved, and this was one of the passages we talked about a year and a half ago nearly, to try to work into our series on love. We move slow, man. We got 3 verses done tonight.
Well,
Tim. It is. It's the pastoral gospel. That's exactly right. It is the shepherding gospel.
I did have one very short final thought.
One final thought.
It's short. I promise it'll be. I'm summarizing it so fast in my head right now. So long story short, our apostles' sheep too. Our elders' sheep as well. Our preachers' sheep as well. I mean, I think, again, when Jesus says, "Tend my lambs, feed my sheep," the closest people to Peter that I can see are sheep of Jesus are his brothers that have all just in their own way denied Jesus. And obviously, on one hand, I think they might be looking at Peter like, "You're the worst of us." I mean, I may have just left Jesus. I denied him one time, but I didn't, deny him 3 times. And so you're the worst of us, Peter. But even in that instance, Jesus says, if you think Peter denied me the worst, he's still someone I have a job to do. And so you other disciples that may feel, beat up and hurt as well for denying me, if I can forgive Peter and the things, and again, if you don't think you're as bad as Peter because you didn't deny me 3 times, I still have work for Peter, so I have work for you too. Yeah. And tend my lambs, feed my sheep could be, Peter, I know you're one of the apostles and your brothers are going to need some help right now. Your brothers are going to need to know that I have forgiveness for them. And again, it might be because, Peter obviously was worse than me, and so if he can forgive Peter, he can forgive, but Peter, I need you to feed my sheep and tend to these other men and bring them and lead them, because I know you're the leader. Lead them as apostles and lead them as the kingdom is here, and be a leader in the kingdom. And so I think that's, for me, one of the most direct ways that Peter can fulfill this is just helping his apostles, his brothers, his disciples, the other apostles with him, heal from the wounds that they have caused in their own hearts because they've failed Jesus as well. But return next week for Peter being Peter.
Peter's not done petering yet. Huh? All right.
I don't know if that was anyways.